Hello and welcome to Dave Makes Stuff. So we started with a stock Audi TT and now at long last we have this. Time to go and liven up the MOT tester's day, I think. Quick primer if you're not from the UK. The MOT test is an annual check that your car needs before it's allowed on the road. So here we are on the road without an MOT. But that's allowed because we're going for an MOT. Right here. There was a certain amount of discussion which could probably be summed up as, "What on earth have you brought us?" And then the test began. And there were lots of elements to it, and realistically we weren't going to pass all of them on the first attempt, so the plan was to come away with a to-do list which hopefully would be shorter than my fairly long arms. The testers themselves were interested, which is always a good sign, even though we had failed by this point already. The first major step was the emissions test. Exhaust smells richer than the Queen is not a good starting point, and you might be able to see on the screen in the background lots of red. Interestingly, it's not chucking out lots of unburnt fuel, but there is too much carbon monoxide, which says the engine's running rich. So that's not great. Next up we're checking out the headlamp alignment. The TT adjusts its headlamp height automatically because it has xenon headlights. They were described as on the floor by the tester. Also on the floor, some coolant. That's a leak I'd best sort out. Those were the literal lowlights of the test. Other than that, I think there was a windscreen wiper needed fixing and a front number plate to hang. I've taken my cars to these guys for a while because they're decent, they're straightforward, they're fair, and they don't get hung up if the car looks a bit odd, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is quite helpful.
I really enjoyed the fact that on the way there we could hear the turbo and it was sounding like it had been modified, but it hadn't been. We hadn't modified it at all. I liked the way that when we were driving past, we could see a couple of people's faces, and they had faces like, "Goodness me," and it was really fun watching that.
So now we've got a fortnight to fix it, and they'll retest it free of charge. So first up, the emissions. For unclear reasons, it appears to have engaged sauna mode without my asking. The exhaust drain is literally dripping, and so question one is, what's coming out of there and why? So I put a pot under there to catch it, and it looks minging. Water with soot in it, which again suggests we're running rich. Now one possible explanation for this was that the engine thought it was cold when it wasn't, and so put extra fuel in. Easiest way to find what the coolant temperature really is to stick someone's meat thermometer in it. And then to check what the engine thought its temperature was, I came across this really neat trick. You press those two buttons on your climate control, and then you can use the temperature control dial to scroll through all sorts of parameters that the climate control system knows about, of which the most interesting to us would be 51°C, which is the engine temperature. Click once more and you find that it's 90 degrees, though in truth if the temperature is in a healthy range it'll read 90 degrees regardless. And then 49°C, which is the coolant temperature. And mid-60s is more or less what the meat thermometer in the header tank told us. So that really appealed to my inner geek. Or maybe my outer geek, one or the other. So if the temperature senders are alright, maybe the airflow meter needs some attention. So I unhitched it and went in search of something to clean it with. Now there are lots of on-the-shelf MAF cleaning products which generally consist of various light hydrocarbons, varying degrees of nastiness, and quite often contain a lot of petrol. So I thought I'd experiment with just dunking the whole thing in petrol. From the cleanliness of the surface, this is clearly not my garage. This is what's referred to as an undisclosed location. It's important it remain that way for my personal safety. So then I took it out of the kitchen and left it to stand a bit and swirled it around and left it a bit longer and swirled it around, and you get the picture. And then I gave it 24 hours to dry out, because I figured sticking extra fuel in the intake probably wouldn't help. And then I put it back in the car and, well, it didn't obviously run better, but it certainly didn't run any worse. So, not the fix this time, but I might store the knowledge away for the future. Now, during the test it leaked coolant all over the floor. Fortunately that was just a hose clamp needed tweaking. But it did remind me of a big power steering pipe dangling in front of the engine that needs sorting out, ideally by replacing it with a smaller pipe. So step one, get something to make a smaller pipe out of. Getting rid of the long pipe will reduce the cooling capacity of the power steering system a bit, so we'll see how that goes. But it also gets rid of a big exposed pipe that was just ripe for getting hit and leaking. I'm going to need to reuse the ends of the original pipe, which means carefully undoing the hose clips with an angle grinder, and then draining out all the fluid. Time to borrow me a couple of ends with an angle grinder. And if you're starting to wonder if I use an angle grinder for everything, the answer is no, not quite. Got to put the ends back on now, with the welder. I'm wearing my new invisible welding gloves, which are great for keeping the heat off, because nobody wants weld spatter burns. And they're so easily avoided just by wearing gauntlets. As ever, I'm welding with overlapping spots as it's easier to control and avoid a big melty hole in the pipe. As long as I get good solid overlap from one spot to the next, the result will be fluid tight, which is rather the name of the game. This whole job is made quite a bit easier by the fact that it's really quite thick-walled tube, so welding is quite straightforward. If I'd cleaned it all out beforehand, then it wouldn't catch fire, which I think would be a shame. With the welds finished, I've got a straightforward way to test if it's got any massive leaks. Fill it with water, sit it upright, leave it for a bit. That all checked out fine, so here's an entirely gratuitous shot of me trying to press it back into position, mostly filming my hand because I know you want to see that, but entirely neglecting to show the rest of the process, the useful bits like fluid and hose clips and other good stuff, because I got all excited to show you the next job. We didn't actually fail on these sharp edges, but they did flag up that we ought to do something about them. So it's time to extend the bodywork a little bit. Starting as usual with a cardboard template, and I'm just going to rub my thumb down the edge of the metal to transfer the shape onto the cardboard. Then I shall return with a completed template and stare meaningfully at it for a bit. Then I shall whip out the grinder, and in mere seconds I shall create a beautiful replica of my cardboard template, which, hopefully, will fit the car. And yeah, it looks pretty reasonable. Obviously it hasn't got the curvature to match the headlight yet, but as the curve is fairly gentle and predictable, I'm just going to stick it in this chunk of girder and hit it with a big hammer. And while you might be thinking, well, that's not a very precise operation, and I agree it isn't, it does seem to deliver results. I suspect if I was using thinner steel it'd move a bit too far and the end result would be a mess. But in this case, what you're seeing here is as it happened. I battered it into shape and it was pretty much spot on the first time. Sorry, I am a professional. Please ignore the surprise in my voice. I'm now going to use my thoroughly junk-covered bender to return the free end towards the bodywork, obviously taking care to bend it in the right direction so I don't have to do it twice. That's come out looking pretty reasonable, and yeah, I think we're good to go. We can weld that in place. I'm using a couple of magnets to make sure everything's aligned properly. Not too many magnets though, as they do really strange things when you weld. It's hard to put my finger on what exactly, but the welder just behaves differently. Yep, still no gauntlets. No, still not a good idea. Got the welding mask though. Welding without that would be really foolish. And at this point I'm really not joking. And that's not the worst vertical up welding I've ever done. Does seem important to me to remove the tail light though before I do the rest of the welding, or we'll be slightly on fire again. My goal with these welds is to get enough welding material in there and good enough penetration that I've got plenty to grind back afterwards. Because they're externally visible, I want to grind them back completely flush. Which means it's angle grinder time again. I'm starting with a cutting wheel to take off the high points, and then once that's done I'm switching over to a sanding disc to take the rest of it down. A sanding disc is good for following contours, a file is good for ignoring contours and imposing flat surfaces and straight lines. So I'm just switching back and forth between the two as I gradually work it down into something resembling the right finish. This is kind of getting there, it's not there yet though. So once again I need to do my bionic file impression. I'm just trying to blend the edges of the weld into the parent metal, and then I'll give it the world's laziest and worst spray paint job just to keep the rust away. Some paint would help to show up if there were any edges left, but that looks alright. And there we are, sharp edges gone, bodywork matches the lights. Good to go I think. And we're off to see the the MOT tester. Though you might quite rightly be wondering, wait, haven't you fixed the emissions yet? And, yes. Maybe. Previously we've seen that the spark plugs are all sooty like there's too much fuel in the engine, but the sensors in the exhaust are saying, well, I don't see a problem here. So clearly somewhere between the engine and that sensor, air is getting in to dilute the mixture. And it was. Turbo flange was leaking, so that's been fixed. And that meant that when the TT disappeared into the MOT test centre, it came out with one of these. We are officially road legal, taxed, insured, ready to go. And if I didn't have a voice suitable for narrating Winnie the Pooh, I might jump around and yell "woo" and things like that, but it would be unseemly, so I shan't. Instead, for the duration of this, we will pretend that what happened next was happily ever after. It drives perfectly, nothing is shrieking, creaking or leaking on the car, not me, and generally everything is spectacular. And to be fair, it wasn't too badly behaved. There are a few things I'd like to investigate, but for now, yeah, all is good. So as always, thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and we'll be back for more in the next one.